One of the many benefits of being a Mott's Wealth Management client is the opportunity to meet and speak with industry specialists and professionals. Our speaker for the Forecast 2017 event is Timothy Horsberg, investment strategist with Oppenheimer Funds. Mr. Horsberg began his career with Oppenheimer Funds in 2010, holds a BA in Economics and Government from Cornell University, and is also a CFA charter holder. This presentation was recorded on January 25th, 2017.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for having me tonight. I'm really happy to be here. So what we're going to talk about tonight is a program that we spent some time working on at Oppenheimer Funds, and specifically one section of that called Historical Context. And Historical Context was a real passion project of ours as we thought about investing and we thought about how clients of ours and their clients approached investing. And really what we wanted to do was help them cut through some of the noise out there in the marketplace today. Because when we looked at the news media or some of the other popular sources of financial information, it wasn't leading to better investment outcomes. And so what we wanted to do, especially with this section, but with the whole program that we looked at, was how can we help both our clients and their clients think more broadly about investing, think a little bit more about markets and about the economy and about where things are headed from a long-term perspective. And so I'm glad to join you today to talk to you just a little bit about this program and a couple of ideas and concepts that we worked on that we think have been helpful over the years as people think about markets. And actually, part of what we did when we started this research and we started to put together this program is we actually met with a consultant, an outside consultant who is a psychologist by training. And this psychologist, she helped us understand this concept of recency bias. And this is something that all humans do, but has applications to investing and finance, which I'll talk about in a second. But the idea of recency bias that she taught us was how we think about the world and remember the past is that we tend to place the greatest weight in our memories on things that just happened. And that's an evolutionary trait that all humans share, but it's pretty interesting when you apply it to markets, when you apply it to understanding where the economy is going from here, and just some ideas that we think have prevented investors from thinking over the long term, because that's one of our big focuses at Oppenheimer Funds, is really to think for the long term, to really stay focused on a long-term strategy and sticking to the plan, because that's what's ultimately led us to successful outcomes over the years. So how the recency bias affects investors in our minds and how this gets applied to investing is this idea that the recency bias for all of us, we're very much influenced by things that recently happened. And in the case of this business, it's the news media, and it's cutting through some of the negative headlines and the near-term noise that prevents people from focusing on long-term, more positive stories that we see out there in the marketplace. Another big element of this, as we just heard about, was 2008, 2009 financial crisis as being another big event that recently happened within the last, let's say now 8 years, 7 years if you're dating it to the fall of 08, or excuse me, to the end of 09. And when we're thinking about investing or focusing on opportunities, that we found cast a little bit of a negative light on a lot of the information that was coming out, a lot of doom and gloom that was really getting in the way of investors taking a little bit of a longer term look at, again, what are the direction or the areas that we see opportunity and how do we see trends playing out. So I think with historical context and with the help of this psychologist who helped us understand recency bias and why it's important to get beyond that, we thought to ourselves, well, what lessons can we learn from history? How can we put where we are today within a historical context, and instead of focusing on something that just happened, or instead of focusing on the last, let's call it 8 years, what about the last 80 years? What about the last 800 years? As crazy as that sounds, what are some lessons that we can draw out of that that can help us make decisions and think about investing from a more informed light as we go forward? So we're going to talk today just a little bit about some of these concepts that we put together in the program and some interesting things we found when we try to really dispel or debunk some common myths and misperceptions by, instead of just going on what we thought, really diving into the numbers. What are the numbers showing us, and how can we draw some lessons out of that that could be helpful as we sort of evaluate what kind of opportunities and risks we're willing to take as we go forward in a really broad sense. And this is part of a larger program that really just helps look at what are some challenges that everyone faces out there as they think about either their long-term plan or investing, or more broadly, just their position within the United States or even the globe. So the first section we looked at were some concerns around overpopulation, or demographics, energy, some of these things that come up frequently in the news media or time and time again that have really prevented people from taking a more optimistic view. And as you'll see as we go through, a lot of these concepts are about looking beyond the near-term noise and really looking at what's the fundamental story. How can we think about these concepts from a long-term view, and what lessons can we draw out of that? So for instance, one of my favorite economists to read about in history, it's more of a history lesson than any kind of economic thinking, is Thomas Malthus, famous economist who predicted back in the 18th century, late 1700s, that the world's population will certainly outstrip its ability to produce food. Therefore, in the near future, the next 50 years, by about the mid-1800s, we're doomed as a planet to starvation. Obviously, that never came to pass, fortunately for all of us sitting here today. But I think it's that persistent myth Malthus placed within our collective consciousness that comes up from time and time again. Is the world becoming too overpopulated? Should we be worried about too many people or all the mouths to feed? But you can see what's happened over the last even just 67 years is tremendous technological improvements, just like it did after Malthus made those predictions at the end of the 1700s, vastly increasing the agricultural capacity of the world. So even today, at a point where you've seen the world population go from about 2.5 billion total people all over the world in 1950 to today, where you've got just about 7 billion people, so about 174% increase, you've seen world grain production far outpace that in terms of growth. And even today, when you think of this overpopulated, congested world, I always like to bring this stat up, that even today with those 7 billion people, the entire population of the world could fit into the state of Texas with only the density of New York City. And coming from New York City, where I just drove down from, it has its moments, but it's not so bad. So I think that when we're looking at some of these myths and misperceptions that are out there in the marketplace, again, we wanted to take, like I keep saying, this longer-term view. How can we think about these trends from a more fundamental standpoint rather than just one headline here or the headlines from the news media or somewhere else? Similarly, one of the big concerns we heard out there was a big obstacle to taking a more optimistic view or wanting to get into markets was this idea of bad demographics. Is the United States destined to become just like Japan, one giant nursing home with a big military? Is that our future? And that was the perception. But when we looked at the reality, although we do have more retirees than we ever have before, we actually still have about 170 million people in that prime working age and household formation cohort, ages 20 to 59. And of the top 10 most common ages here in the United States, some are in their 50s, but the other half, about another 5, are in their 20s. So again, I think that what we wanted to do was get beyond the popular perception or get beyond the scary headlines that may be preventing people from taking a little bit more of an optimistic view on where we're headed from here as a country and as a globe or as a world, and looking at, what are the numbers? How can we dive into the numbers and really look at the story and help us really think more constructively about where we're headed going from here, and not just focus on some near-term noise or the most recent headline you read or that bad financial crisis that happened now in the past but not so far away. Another look at demographics that we like to think about is projections. Well, actually, the United States projected out to 2050 as far as the G20 goes, sort of the 20 wealthiest world economies, are actually still projected to be one of the youngest on average age countries, leaving places like Japan or Italy or Germany in the dust in terms of demographics with an average age of 39. Again, older than the US average age ever has been, but still relative to the rest of the world, still one of the youngest countries in history. One thing we heard about a little earlier, student loan debt, another area of big concern. There is $1 trillion of student loan debt outstanding, or a little bit more than that here in the United States right now. But one of the interesting stats we looked at to say, is this only a negative story, was actually one of the biggest gainers in average debt by educational attainment were those pursuing graduate or advanced degrees, things like a law degree, business degree, PhD, and they actually had one of the lowest unemployment rates of all degree holders after they finished their degree, under 2%. So most of those advanced degree holders were able to find jobs and pay down some of that additional debt that they had found. So although there is some negative, let's say, parts to an increasing student loan burden here in the United States, we looked at the components of it, and there are actually still some positive stories here, and the United States being the most educated it ever has been, both in terms of undergraduate and also graduate degrees, has been one of those positive or silver linings that we saw as we looked at educational attainment and some of the concerns around student loans. Another myth or misperception that we wanted to tackle was around, getting back to our friend Thomas Malthus, some of those prognostications of peak resources, peak oil, peak anything. In the early 80s, that was the popular conception, was that we were going to run out of oil in the near future. By 1985, only about less than $1 trillion of proven world oil reserves. So those are the ones that they knew about, that they could find. And that didn't seem like enough. It seemed like by the year 2000 or beyond that maybe we would even face skyrocketing prices and oil running out. Obviously, that didn't come to pass. And in fact, technology changed that, where today we have almost double the number of proven oil reserves that we did 30 years ago. So how did you go from 0.77 to 1.7 and increasing your proven oil reserves? Well, it's technology. You can see on the left-hand side, I'm showing the technology to drill land wells, the technology to drill offshore rigs have both vastly improved. And then there's unconventional plays, things like the shale oil and gas plays out west and places like Texas or North Dakota. New technologies unlocked sources of energy we couldn't even conceive of 30 years ago. And so I think that what we wanted to do here, again, is just to take a look at what were some of those myths or misperceptions out there in the culture that maybe prevented people from taking a little bit more of an optimistic view on the global economy, or a more constructive view on where markets were going based on some near-term concerns that, for instance, technology was able to unlock in ways that, again, we never could have anticipated. So I think moving on to the next section within historical context, our goal here was to take a look at the human condition. Have we reached a point, a plateau, stalled progress where we're not seeing much improvement in living standards or the way that people live their lives? There were a lot of headlines about real income and how it hadn't really increased for most Americans in 10 years or more, and that was a very negative story. So we wanted to say, has the human condition been improving, and can we extrapolate any lessons from that about where we think it will go from here? And we can see as economies evolve, you do go through different phases, things moving from agriculture to industrial revolution to information age and the future, where you can find some of those value-added jobs that we've talked about already. So when we looked at the U.S. and where it is within the global position, just thinking about economies evolving, how has our position in the world changed? One of the big things we've heard highlighted that was very negative was, well, the U.S. used to be about half of world output back in the 50s and 60s. Today, we're only about 22, 25% of all the economic activity in the United States, or in the world. So that must be a bad thing. Surely, we've gone from being a lot of global economic activity to relatively less. But we looked at, rather than the slice of the pie, the size of the pie. And then it became a much more optimistic story, because back in 1960, we were about half of 1.3 trillion. That was all the economic activity, all the GDP out there in the world. Today, there's about 78 trillion, and we're only 22% of that. So our slice of the pie is smaller, but our slice that we're getting is far larger than it was back then. In fact, this is one of the more optimistic stories we've seen, which is that the US has grown along with the rest of the world. And so we've seen a decline in global poverty, all of these things that are good things that come along with it, that we think these trends have really shown us that even if there's some near-term pauses or some concerns around certain areas, it's truly an optimistic story that we found when we looked at the human condition, both globally. And what's driven that is education levels. For instance, literate population in the world's gone from just over half of the entire world knowing how to read in 1950 to today we're almost 85%, getting close to 90% of the world can read, which is a tremendous accomplishment when we're thinking about, again, what trends are we watching? Where are things going? Have we seen any setbacks? And actually, this is a lot more of a positive story than I think you would hear in any kind of near-term news or sort of focus piece on one particular area. Similarly, you've seen the growth in middle class going from only about 30% of the world population to more like 53 expected by 10 years from today or a little less. So again, when we're thinking about these trends, what's driving them and do we see these set to continue? This is from the Cato Institute, where we looked at the rise in economic freedom, countries under free economic systems. The red dots were countries that weren't in 1970. The red dots are countries that aren't today. You can see there's a lot less red on the screen. These are where we're seeing trends that we think have really actually improved and changed the trajectory of the way that we think about global growth and optimistic stories about living standards and really the human condition. This study I thought was interesting. What we looked at here was actually, and just to say before I start, one life lost in conflict is obviously one life too many. But one of the pernicious myths that we ran into or obstacles that we saw when we heard from clients what are some things that they're battling is the idea that the world feels like a very dangerous place. I'm always seeing headlines about something that's going on in the Middle East or in Eastern Europe or wherever it is that may be. I hear some terrible story. It feels like it's never been more dangerous before. And so we said, well, let's take a look at that. This is when I was talking about maybe not the last 8 years, but what about the last 80 or 800? What lessons can we draw that will help us place where we are today within a historical context? And one of the things is the percentage of the world population that was killed in various conflicts. And again, not to make light of any life lost, but you can see coming in almost chronological order some of the major world conflicts in history and the percentage of the world's population that was killed in those conflicts, things like World War II or World War I. And the interesting conclusion we saw when we looked at that versus our present area is actually, unlike popular perception, we're living in the safest time in human history. And that was really surprising to us as we pulled all this together, as we looked at the numbers and we really considered what it meant to the human condition and what direction we were going in and where we've been. And so this to us really surprised us. It's another really optimistic story that when we dove into the numbers, rather than just listening to the headlines, we saw a much more interesting and optimistic story. So when we talk about the good old days, or you hear hearkening back to the 50s, some of these stats, we looked at, well, has the average life or the average American's life improved since then? And the answer is almost without a doubt. Things even as simple as how big was the average home? It was just under 1,000 square feet in 1950. Today it's about 2,300 square feet. Average family size has almost double the amount of space, if not more. You can look at quality of life. You have almost a decade more of life expectancy here in the United States, 10 extra years of average life expectancy for Americans today than you did back then. So although it may seem like the good old days when we actually compare the numbers, we looked at an America that's living more prosperously, longer, healthier lives than ever before. Even something like what I talk about, the financial crisis, was that sort of our generation's Great Depression or something that was akin to that earth-shaking event back in the 30s, but actually the magnitude was far smaller. Whether you're just looking at the peak unemployment rate, about 25% during the Great Depression, here in the United States during the most recent financial crisis, 2008, 2009, it was only about 10%. And a lot of these metrics today look far more tame than what prior generations have experienced. So when we're looking at some of these stories, you can tell where I'm taking you on this is that it's actually a more optimistic look at some of the trends, some of the concerns, and some of the things that have prevented people from really getting into markets or taking a more optimistic view. Another idea that we hear a lot is the American dream dead? Have we become so stratified as a society that people can't really move between social classes, wherever you're born is where you stay. That actually hasn't been the case. One of the things that we looked at, which we thought was pretty interesting, was that 80% of millionaires today didn't inherit more than 10% of their wealth. So the vast majority of people who are billionaires even were in the on deck or first base, individuals who were either born lower or middle class or had less than $1 million in startup capital for their ideas. So that's well over half are still strivers who make it to the big leagues, are still strivers who are able to prosper, grow, and really better their life situation. So it's not quite as negative of a story there as we may think. You know, another area that's been focused, or we've had a lot of focus on over the years has been manufacturing, the decline of U.S. manufacturing, the death of manufacturing. But actually, what was interesting to us is that in terms of value add, so what goes into that manufacturing supply chain, so not just nuts and bolts, but design, marketing, research, all the development that goes into it, the U.S. still leads the world in terms of value add for manufacturing countries. So that was really interesting to us. So this last section in historical context, as I wrap up, is one that's been fun to present all fall, which is hating the government is not an investment strategy. And I think you can anticipate where some of this is going from here. So it was a fun fall to talk to clients, to listen to concerns, and think about some of the issues, not from a partisan lens or even a near-term investing lens, but again, long-term, what are some lessons from history that we can learn that can help us invest in and around presidential election cycles or more broadly political control? And as you can see, we haven't actually, aside from our angry protesters there, we haven't found too much to be worried about. One of the things that we thought was really interesting was we looked at an investment strategy, and we call this our partisan portfolios. And we looked at 3 investment strategies. And all of them we started in 1945 with $10,000. And the first investment strategy was our Democratic portfolio. You only invested in the markets when Democrats were in control of the White House. The second portfolio was a Republican portfolio. You only invested in markets when Republicans were in the White House. And then the third portfolio are our green bipartisan friends, where you stayed fully invested the entire time. You started in 1945 and you didn't change your investment strategy based on political control of the White House. And as you can see, that bipartisan staying the course portfolio did dramatically better than either one of the partisan portfolios. And so the lesson to us as we looked at this, when we saw $10,000 grow to almost 1.3 million over that time period in the Dow Jones Industrial Average Index, was that investors can do well in a variety of political environments. And actually, who's in control of the White House has less of an impact on portfolio returns than the strategy itself, where you decide to spend the most time. And so that was interesting to us. Another stat that is less relevant today, because obviously we're in a unified party control situation, was that we actually saw divided government being somewhat better for markets over history. So I think that was sort of an interesting fact as we face the prospect of a lot of partisan gridlock over the past few years and going forward, even with unified party control. As we know, President Donald Trump doesn't always see eye to eye with some of the congressional leaders, so it bears reminding that even divided government can still be a good time for markets. This study is one that I like, and I think was an interesting realization for us as we did this project and we thought about, again, historical context. How can we learn some lessons from history that help us be better investors, that help us think more clearly about trends in the global economy and where we think things are going? So what we looked at here was this blue line is the Gallup approval rating poll. And as a reminder, when the Gallup poll is 100, that means everybody Gallup talked to approved of the job that the current administration was doing. The Gallup poll was 0. That meant everybody Gallup polled disapproved of the job that the current administration was doing. So 50 is the dividing line. Over 50 means half the country, or more than half the country, approves of the president. Below 50, more than half of the country disapproves of the job that the president's doing. And then we compared that to our friend, the Dow Jones Industrial Average Index. And we looked at stock market performance during various administrations. So we went back to the beginning of the Kennedy administration. So we got a nice handful of both Democratic and Republican presidents. And we assumed when we went into this analysis, we had an idea, a hypothesis that we wanted to test, which was as Americans felt better about the White House or what was going on in government, markets did better. That was a self-reinforcing cycle. That's what we thought going into this project. what we found, and what was really interesting to us and why we like showing this slide so much, is actually the best period for market returns, the period when the Dow did the best over the prior 70 or so years, was actually when the presidential approval rating was between 36 and 50. So that meant that over half the country disapproved of the job that the current administration was doing in the White House during the best periods for market returns. So that was really interesting to us for a couple of reasons. But I think to sum it up, what we found was rather than me stand up here and say, this party in control of this branch of government or this or that provides better market returns, it's really to say investors can do well in a variety of political environments. And actually, it turns out it doesn't really matter if you approve or you like what's going on in Washington. You can still prosper, you can still do well in markets over the long term, even during periods of political leadership where certain people may not be happy. Because we heard a lot of objections. My preferred candidate didn't win local office, state office, or federal office. I can't get involved in markets. I can't invest in this kind of environment. And we looked to this study to say, actually, you can dislike what's going on in Washington and still do really well. Another question we get a lot, and one that's also fun to talk about, is, has it ever been this bad? How can we take a historical approach or place where we are in the current political climate over history? Can we learn any lessons? Have we gotten to new lows? And actually, when we went through history, we found some lower lows, if you can believe it, in the early years of our republic. So on the left-hand side, we're showing some broadsides. They used to have these newspapers that they could print, mostly right here in Philadelphia, John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800. Some things said about each other's character that I can't even read out loud in polite company here tonight, but it's quite inflammatory about each other and almost certainly not true. But I think that the idea that our political discourse has always been vitriolic is something that is important to remember coming out of a heated political season where both sides were, let's say, less than civil at times to each other. And on the right-hand side, this is a woodcut from a very famous event, one of my personal heroes, Alexander Hamilton. They've got a musical about him now on Broadway, was actually felled by a sitting vice president, challenged Aaron Burr to a duel. They dueled on the cliffs of Weehawken right across from New York City. And he, as a former Treasury Secretary, was shot dead by the sitting Vice President Aaron Burr. So as long as we're not having duels in Weehawken, it's actually, if you can believe it, a better political climate today than what we've had in the past. So I think that when we're taking, again, a historical perspective to really look at, is this the worst it's ever been? Can we draw any lessons out of history that help us think about markets more constructively or focus on the good things that we see out there in the world today? It's actually more of an optimistic story than you may think. Even some intractable or seemingly intractable problems, things like the debt or the deficit, who's going to buy all of this debt? Well, actually, of the top 5 holders of U.S. Treasury debt, still the two we hear a lot about, China and Japan, but there's also the U.S. government in terms of the Fed, Social Security trust funds, and others. In individual investors are the third largest savings bonds, and then pension funds here in the United States that are still some of the biggest holders of U.S. debt. So I think that when we're looking at this chart, you can see over history there have been some periods where it's gotten out of whack, it's come back into line, and so this is one of those problems that we think is more solvable than many people may think if you take a long-term perspective and really look over history. Similarly, things like Social Security program or entitlement programs, things that seem so big, so impossible to surmount. How could anyone ever get on board with investing or think more constructively about the direction of both the world economy, the U.S. economy, the federal government going from here, especially during a period of transition like we're going through right now. But as you can see, even something as big and as important as Social Security, there are options out there. It's going to take bipartisan solutions, bipartisan agreement to come up and pick one of these. But things like just raising the full retirement age for younger people, or reducing your cost of living adjustments, or even just eliminating the taxable minimum for Social Security could all fix this problem in relatively short order. So I think when we're tackling some of these big entitlement programs like Medicare, like Social Security, like Medicaid, entitlements that seem so large and so impossible to fix, there are solutions out there. And again, taking that historical perspective to look at some of these can help us really take a more optimistic view. So I think just to wrap up this section and wrap up what I'm here to tell you today, what we wanted to do with this program, and especially with this section that I've just presented to you, is again, tackle some of those myths and misperceptions that are out there that really prevent people from taking a more constructive view on investing, from really preventing people from getting into markets and thinking about the long term and focusing too much, we think, on the near-term noise. Because again, whether it's financial news on TV, on the internet, or in the newspapers, they're not there to sell you better investment advice. They're there to sell ads to you and get you to read their articles. And that's not necessarily the same interest you may have by reading those articles. So I think when we're thinking about this program and what we wanted to do with it, it was really to cut through some of that noise and help us focus on the big picture and think about some of the stories that we can extrapolate from what's gone on in history to see those big picture trends, not just the next year or the next few months, but what about the next 10 years? What about the next 100 years? How have things played out over long-term historical epochs in the past? And so again, it's to take those trends, extrapolate them, and really learn to keep everything in perspective in our current heated, very, very, very short-term perspective on things. So with that, I'll wrap up my prepared remarks. I'd be happy to take any questions. And thank you again for having me out tonight. So.
Any questions for Tim at all?
One here, if I may. About 2 or 3 slides ago, there was a big spike in debt off to the left-hand side. I couldn't read it from here. Yeah, what happened there?
So that was World War II. So that was when we saw a big spike in spending during the war, and then you can see that came down pretty significantly right afterwards. So that was one of those times when we looked at something that looked pretty scary, but then through a combination of tighter spending, obviously as military spending wound down, and a little bit stronger growth, we were able to get through that. So.
Cool. Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Tim.
Okay.
Appreciate
Thanks
it.
again.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Timothy Horsberg. And if you have a friend or relative who is considering their financial options, please feel free to invite them to accompany you to one of our upcoming events. Visit our website at www.mottswealthmanagement.com for the most up-to-date listing of these events. Over the years, many of our clients have asked Melissa to speak with a friend, relative, or colleague concerning private financial management. Melissa considers it an honor and a privilege and has been happy to accommodate those wishes. For your future reference, please be aware of the standards by which she complies with such requests. First, confidentiality is the cornerstone of our business. Each of our client relationships is distinctly separate and totally private. Second, thoughtful and courteous service is guaranteed. This is a people business. Finally, Melissa will never give advice and counsel to a client without thoroughly understanding his or her needs. Please contact us at 215-513-6240 or send Melissa an email at melissa@mottswealthmanagement.com. Melissa H. Motts is a registered representative, securities offered through Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer, member FINRA SIPC. Melissa H. Motts is an investment advisor representative, Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Motts Wealth Management and Cambridge are not affiliated.